The alarm hadn't even gone off yet, and I already had my eyes open. I don't know how it happened. I usually hate waking up before it rings. But today, there was no familiar, hazy sleepiness that helps me delay the start of the day. I got up without trying to fall back asleep, as I usually do. A gray light seeped through the window. The sky, hidden behind a thin veil of clouds, seemed to reflect everything I felt inside. My footsteps on the wooden floor sounded loud in the silence of the house. I set the kettle on the stove and pulled out a couple of slices of bread for toast. Everything was just as usual, just like always. And on the other side of the wall, like every day, the TV was quietly playing. Not that I always listened to it, but now it felt like every word, every movement behind the wall highlighted the emptiness that had settled in our home. Liam was sitting on the couch, staring at his phone screen. He didn't even notice when I set the plate of toast in front of him. I knew he wouldn't pay attention. This was always the case. He was stuck in that world where news updates mattered more than breakfast conversations. He just absent-mindedly lifted his head and asked, "Do you want some scrambled eggs?" "Just toast," I replied. And without lifting his gaze from the screen, he nodded and went back to his phone. I looked at him carefully. He nodded again and returned to the screen. How did we get here? When did we stop being the ones who laughed in the mornings, argued, kissed before going off to work? These questions kept rising in my mind over and over again, but never found an answer. The toast had gotten cold, and the kettle had long since turned off. But I didn't care. Tonight, Liam had a work dinner, just like always. I thought about him, thought about us, and the further I went, the more I realized something was changing. Not that he had become someone else, but we weren't who we used to be anymore. On my way to the school where I work as a psychologist, my thoughts still kept returning home. No matter how hard I tried to focus on the upcoming day, that cold morning moment still wouldn't let go of me. The same question kept swirling in my mind. Why had everything become so alien? But as soon as I stepped through the school doors, all my inner musings seemed to evaporate. Here, I was needed again. I knew that as soon as I entered my office, I'd be greeted by students with their endless questions, colleagues who needed my opinion or help. I always felt like I could be myself at school. Here, I wasn't just a woman lacking her husband's attention. I was a professional, valued for my knowledge and experience. "Susan, can you come to my office after class?" Lauren, our principal, called to me in the hallway. I nodded, not asking any unnecessary questions. Lauren had always been a serious woman, rarely engaging in conversations that weren't work-related. After class, I went to her office. She was sitting at her desk, flipping through some papers. "We have a new vice principal," Lauren said, not lifting her eyes from the papers. "Adam Spencer. He'll be taking charge of bringing order to the school." I stopped, waiting for more. "He's experienced, ambitious," Lauren added, glancing at me. "I think he'll be a great support." I just nodded. Of course, I was curious to know who this person was. But honestly, I couldn't focus on Lauren's words. Thoughts about the emptiness of the morning, about the changes in my life, still held me. The principal kept talking, but I no longer heard her. "Susan, would you be willing to work with him soon?" she asked, lifting her gaze. "Of course," I replied, barely aware that I was already being asked to participate in something new, something that might distract me, if only for a while, from the inner emptiness. The first meeting with Adam Spencer took place in the conference room, and honestly, I was a little surprised by his energy. He entered the room as though every step had been precisely calculated, as if his presence alone was meant to change the atmosphere. Tall, slim, with dark hair neatly slicked back, he carried himself confidently, like someone who knew exactly what he wanted and wasn't afraid to say it. He began by presenting his mission: to implement new standards and elevate the school to a new level. Colleagues listened, exchanging glances, and I noticed how some appeared impressed while others were wary. His energy was contagious, and despite my internal doubts, I felt something inside me starting to resonate with him. "We need to reach a new level," he said, turning toward us. His voice was firm, his eyes sharp as if he were trying to understand each one of us. I didn't immediately understand why this was so important to me, but in that moment, I was genuinely struck by the way he spoke about the future. There was something in his confidence that made me believe he could accomplish everything he was saying. Then, unexpectedly, he looked directly at me. "Susan, I've heard good things about you," Adam said, and I involuntarily flinched. "You run the teen support program, right?" I didn't even know he could know anything about me beyond my name. I wasn't usually in the spotlight, and when he spoke to me, I felt as though the entire room disappeared, and the focus was solely on me through the gaze of this new person. It was strange and a little unsettling. "Yes," I replied, feeling slightly awkward but trying to maintain my composure. "I run that program." "Great," he said. "We're looking for new ideas to improve it. I'd like to discuss it with you. Come by my office after the meeting." I nodded, feeling a tension building within me. It was just an offer, a work-related discussion. But suddenly, I sensed something important pressing down on me. It wasn't just professional attention. It was more. The meeting ended, and as I walked down the hallway, I still couldn't shake the thought of him. Who was he? Why did his gaze linger in my mind? At the end of the workday, I made my way to Adam's office. It was a strange feeling, as if I were heading toward something important, but also a little bit intimidating. When I entered, he was already sitting at his desk, organizing papers and jotting something down. "Please, have a seat," he said without looking up from his work, gesturing to the chair across from him. I sat down, and he continued sorting through the documents, absorbed in his preparations. "Thank you for coming," he finally said, lifting his head. His gaze was focused, but not cold, more like someone who was deeply engaged in something significant. "We have an idea for improving the teen program," Adam continued, and I felt his enthusiasm start to spark something in me. "I'd like to discuss with you what we could do better." We began discussing the project, and I was impressed by his attention to detail. He wasn't just throwing out ideas. He was analyzing every aspect, looking for solutions to each problem. His approach was thoughtful, and I realized he genuinely wanted to make a difference. "We need your expertise," he said, and I felt my shoulders relax slightly at those words. He valued my work, and it was unexpectedly pleasant. In the past few months, I hadn't felt like anyone had taken such a genuine interest in my ideas. I began explaining how our program worked, the problems we faced, and what we might need to change. Adam listened carefully, asked questions, and made suggestions. It was like talking to someone who wasn't just conversing with you, but was truly trying to understand what could be altered, improved, made better. The more I spoke, the more I realized how long it had been since I'd felt so appreciated for my work. There were moments when I seemed to lose touch with reality, engrossed in the conversation with him. I couldn't quite put my finger on what made this conversation so captivating. When the meeting ended and I left his office, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. I hadn't even realized that in my mind, the thought was forming that this wasn't just a work project. It was something more, and perhaps he was a part of it. That evening, when I got home, I found Liam sitting in front of his laptop. He didn't lift his eyes from the screen even when I set dinner in front of him. I wanted to tell him about the project, how inspired I felt by the new plan, but he just nodded, not breaking away from his work. His reaction was so indifferent that I immediately realized it didn't interest him. It wasn't even worth starting the conversation. I set the plate on the table and sat down across from him, feeling how the difference in our moods had become even more palpable. Weeks flew by unnoticed. I found myself staying late at school more and more, discussing the details of the new project with Adam. We worked on the program, exchanging ideas, developing strategies, and planning changes that were meant to bring results. Each of our meetings became more productive, more engaging. He was incredibly attentive to every word I said, asking clarifying questions, offering his own ideas. There was something in his approach that made me feel important, as if every word I spoke truly mattered. I even started to feel a little proud of being able to be of use to him. After all, this wasn't just a discussion of the program's details, it was real collaboration. Adam wasn't just leading, he was involving me, valuing my expertise and listening to my opinions. And with each conversation, I felt something I had long been missing returning to me: confidence in myself and in what I was doing. One day, after a particularly long meeting, I stayed in the office trying to finish the last points of our plan. It was already late, and the hallway had nearly emptied. I sat at the table, staring at the papers, not noticing how time passed. Suddenly, I heard a voice. "Susan, you're still here?" Adam asked, peeking into the office. He looked tired, but his eyes, as always, were full of energy. "Yes, I want to finish the plan so we can discuss it tomorrow," I replied, not taking my eyes off the paper. "I stayed late too," he said, sitting on the edge of the desk. "Let's go through the points together and see what we can clarify." We started discussing the remaining details, and I noticed how the conversation flowed easily, almost automatically. Sometimes, when he suggested something, I felt that I could contribute my own ideas, and they mattered. It wasn't just a project discussion, it was something more: an experience where your voice truly matters, where your thoughts are heard and valued. Time passed quickly. I barely noticed the evening slipping away until I glanced at the clock. It was already late, and we were still sitting there discussing the details as if time didn't matter. When the meeting ended, I felt more alive than ever. Not only because the project was moving forward, but because I once again felt that I had a right to my opinion, that I could influence what was happening around me. Returning home, I was full of energy, but as soon as I stepped inside, all that energy collided with what awaited me. Liam was sitting in front of his laptop, not paying any attention to me. I felt the inner contrast between the reality I had with him and what was happening at work becoming even more apparent. He noticed I'd come home late, but didn't say anything. We silently had dinner, silently shared the evening. Our conversations had become rare, and their content formal, as if a wall had grown between us, a wall neither of us had noticed until it was too late. Liam started to notice that I was staying late at work more and more. Each day, he increasingly made it clear that he was bothered by how absorbed I was in the project. He didn't say it directly, but I could feel his growing discontent with each late return of mine. "Are you at school again?" he asked one evening when I came home late. His voice lacked its usual warmth, replaced by a cold, tired edge. "Yes, there was another thing I had to discuss with Adam," I answered, but something inside me tightened. I knew it wasn't just about the work. "You spend so much time there. It's just a project," he said, looking up from his screen. He spoke softly, but I could feel the weight of his disappointment in those words. "It's important," I replied, feeling my voice falter. Not because I doubted the project, but because something inside me was breaking. I felt our connection starting to fade, but I couldn't figure out how to fix it. We sat down to dinner. The food was on the table, but the atmosphere felt as if we were sitting in an empty room where nothing was left but silence and the strange, unfamiliar glances we exchanged. He no longer asked about what I was doing. He didn't show interest in the project or how my day had gone. Our conversations became increasingly dry and formal, as if we were two strangers forced to live under the same roof. I tried to find the words to tell him how much I missed his attention, his involvement. But all I could do was remain silent, feeling the growing chasm between us. I began to realize that our home was no longer the place where I could feel safe. It had become just a place where I was stuck, not knowing how to return to what I had lost. But I couldn't place it all on Liam. That wouldn't be fair. I was changing too. And I wasn't sure anymore if this place, this home where we lived, was still my home. One morning, waking up to the sound of the alarm, I saw a message from Adam. He simply wrote, "How are you? Did you sleep well?" Honestly, I wasn't expecting that. We rarely exchanged such messages, and it felt strange, but at the same time, somehow important. I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking, why now? And what if I respond? I felt something stir inside me, but I couldn't understand what it was. A few minutes later, I typed my reply. "Almost didn't sleep. How about you?" The response came instantly, almost immediately. Me too, thinking about the project. And not just that. Those words hit me like a bolt of lightning. Why did I feel that it wasn't just about the project? He wrote, not just that. It sounded so honest, so unlike a business conversation. My heart tightened, and I immediately realized I had crossed a line. I felt something shift. This simple exchange of words, just a few phrases, but they were filled with something that wasn't there before. At some point, I realized I couldn't be indifferent like before. I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was happening. In that moment, I felt my inner world sway. I looked at the screen and typed again. I'm thinking about the project too, and not just that. That was my honesty, at least in reply. And to be honest, I couldn't hide what had awakened inside me anymore. After sending the message, I leaned back in my chair and thought, this wasn't just curiosity. It was something more. But what exactly? Everything became so blurry and hard to discern. I could no longer say for sure where work ended and where something else began. Something I wasn't supposed to think about. A minute later, I got the next message from Adam. I'm glad we can work together, Susan, but honestly, I'd like to talk to you about something else. How about meeting up? I was standing at a crossroads. It was the moment when I realized I might be about to make a step that could change everything forever. But still, I typed my reply. I'm not sure that's a good idea. Minutes dragged on, but something inside me told me I needed to do something to understand what was happening. A few seconds later, I typed, okay. 8 p.m. In the evening, I arrived at the cafe near my school. It was a small, cozy place where you could usually find people who were simply seeking silence after a long workday. But now it had become a place where I felt nervous, as if each step I took was too heavy. I almost didn't notice when I sat down at the table waiting for him. When Adam walked in, I noticed him immediately. He was, as always, calm and confident, but there was something different in his eyes, something I couldn't immediately understand. He smiled and sat down across from me, and for a moment, silence hung between us. Thank you for coming, he said, and his voice was unexpectedly soft. I didn't know how to begin. I stayed silent, unsure of what to reply. We sat there, neither of us able to say what had been hanging in the air for so long but couldn't be put into words. I think about you more than I should, he said suddenly, a little hesitantly. Those words struck me like an arrow. I froze, trying to process what he had just said. I looked at him, and for a moment it felt like everything around us disappeared. The people in the cafe, the noise outside. Everything became irrelevant. All that mattered was that moment when his eyes met mine. He was waiting for my reaction, but I couldn't find the words. I remained silent for a long time, and in that silence, I realized that I could no longer take it back. I couldn't just go back to my old life and ignore this feeling that had settled inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about what had happened between us. And it was more than just thoughts about the project, about work. I'm sorry if this is inappropriate, he added, a little embarrassed. He lowered his gaze as if trying to take back his words. I could feel something tense up in him, as if he was struggling with his own emotions. I lifted my gaze and my heart started to race. I think about you too, I finally said, and those words escaped me as if I couldn't hold them back any longer. In that moment, I realized I could no longer keep my feelings hidden. It was strange and at the same time, liberating. I no longer felt fear or doubt. In that moment, only one thing mattered. I had been honest with myself. We sat in silence for a minute, as if both of us were experiencing this moment of honesty. I felt like I was on the edge. On the edge of what? I didn't know. But one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. He looked up and smiled, and in his eyes, I saw something I couldn't ignore. He too didn't know what would happen next, but his gaze told me that he was ready to figure it out with me. A few days passed, and life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But inside, everything had changed. I walked around the school, taught my classes, but each time I stopped to take a deep breath, I felt his gaze, his words, his presence. I tried to focus on my work, but in my head, only one question echoed. What now? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important between us. But what exactly? And how much could it change everything? Then everything changed again. One evening, when I came home, there was a postcard from Liam on the kitchen counter. It was strange. We hadn't written notes to each other in a long time, and usually, things like that were a thing of the past. I opened the envelope and saw his handwriting. What's this? It was the only thing he had written. A simple question. I sighed and set the postcard aside. I wasn't ready for this. I still didn't know how to explain to him what was happening in my life. A few minutes later, I heard Liam come home. He walked into the kitchen, looked at me, and there was something new in his gaze. He didn't say anything, but I felt the atmosphere between us had drastically changed. What's this? He asked again, pointing to the phone in my hands. I stayed silent, unsure of what to say. You understand this is cheating, right? His voice was calm, but there was a pain hidden beneath his even tone. I couldn't answer. I had no justification, and I couldn't defend myself. I just sat there, in the kitchen, staring at him, not knowing how to explain that I couldn't go back. I couldn't deny what I had experienced, couldn't just erase those feelings. But I couldn't say that I wanted to continue them either. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to cope with what had been broken between us. He was silent, and I sat there, feeling the growing chasm between us. We both remained silent because neither of our words could change what had happened. The night passed in silence. Liam didn't lie down next to me. I felt the coldness of his silence slowly fill the space that had once been our home. The morning came just like any other, but this time everything felt different. Thoughts of Liam, our conversation, and what had happened between me and Adam wouldn't leave me. I couldn't keep living in this state of uncertainty. I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay in this empty house, pretending everything was fine when everything inside me was falling apart. Liam was silent as usual. He was in the room, but it felt like he wasn't really there. I couldn't stay silent anymore, hiding my feelings, pretending things would go back to how they were. I knew something had to be done, and that something would probably be the hardest decision of my life. After breakfast, I decided to go to school early. I had a few things to take care of, and I knew I needed to talk to Adam. I couldn't keep these emotions bottled up inside, pretending that nothing had changed between us. But I also knew I couldn't continue living in this painful silence with Liam. I needed to figure out what I truly wanted. When I came back home, Liam was already there. He was sitting on the couch, absorbed in a book. But I noticed how his gaze briefly flickered over me. He knew something was happening, but perhaps he hadn't yet realized how much had changed. I walked over to him and he looked up. We were silent. In that silence, there was everything. Words couldn't convey what I felt. I knew I had to say something. We need to talk, I said, looking him in the eyes. He nodded without asking what it was about, but I could see that something inside him was breaking too. He already knew that this conversation wouldn't be easy. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. We need to stop, I said, feeling as if each word tore a part of me away. I understood that I couldn't keep living the way we had been living. Liam looked at me. He was silent. There was no anger in his eyes, no accusations, only understanding. It was probably the hardest thing for me. He already knew that our life together had, in essence, come to an end. Why? He asked calmly, as if he didn't want me to think he didn't understand. I can't do this anymore. I've lost myself. I've lost us, Liam. I can't keep living in this shadow when everything inside me is screaming that I can't be who I was. I can't live in a lie. I just can't. He nodded, and I felt like that moment stretched on forever. He didn't say anything else. But in his silence, I heard everything that needed to be said. We both knew that trust doesn't rebuild overnight, and that our relationship wasn't what it had once been. The next morning, I came to school and found out Adam was gone. His office was empty. There were no farewells, no explanations. He had just disappeared. And in that moment, I felt as though so much of my life was slipping away. I was lost, but I knew I had made my choice. Liam didn't forgive me right away. He said it would take time to rebuild what had been broken. I didn't know if we could rebuild our relationship, but I was willing to try. In the end, I realized that before building something with someone else, I had to first figure things out with myself. Adam never wrote again, and I was alone once more, but not the same person I had been before. I could no longer return to the past. Life gradually started to rebuild itself, strangely, in its new rhythm. Although Liam didn't forgive me right away, in his silence, I felt that not everything was lost between us. We began to talk more. And perhaps that was the hardest part, trying to regain even a fragment of what had been between us before. But I already knew I couldn't just return to the old life that no longer felt like mine. I tried to understand what had happened to me. Why had I allowed myself to drift away from myself? Why, after leaving Liam, did I face the reality that nothing could restore the lost trust, and feelings had become so tangled? I was lost, yet grateful for the time that had given me the chance to figure things out with myself. With each passing day, I felt more and more that something needed to change. It wasn't so much about Liam, but about me. I realized I couldn't live with the divide between what I felt and what I had been forced to hide. I could have continued like this, but it would have been dishonest to both him and myself. Liam began talking about the future, about how difficult it was for him to go through all of this. He had also been changed by this time. We learned to communicate again, to find the words that could help us move forward. But I knew the real work was just beginning. And perhaps, even if we managed to rebuild something, it wouldn't be what it was before. We would be different, and we both had to be ready for that. I wasn't expecting an easy path. I understood that trust wouldn't be restored after a few conversations, that not everything could be returned. But what mattered was that we were ready to move forward, that we both started accepting responsibility for what had happened. Sometimes I think back to that time, to those days when everything was so tangled and complicated, and I realize I had to go through it, because now I was starting to understand that in order to build something real, I first needed to figure things out with myself. And maybe only then could I allow myself to be with someone who would walk beside me. Adam never wrote again, and I didn't look for him. Sometimes I think about him, about what had been, but each time I remind myself that now I have to be honest with myself before seeking someone or something that will do that for me. I didn't know what would come next, but maybe that didn't matter. What mattered was that I could move forward again, without hiding from myself. Time passed, and although much remained uncertain, I felt that I had truly taken a step toward change. There were no dramatic signs of recovery, no instant transformations, but I felt real changes happening inside me, and that was enough. Liam and I started spending more time together, but it was no longer in the same way it had been before. We began to communicate not through expectations and hidden resentments, but honestly. This didn't mean that everything was instantly better, but I felt that there was once again space for honesty in our home. We learned to listen to each other, to try to understand. It was hard, but it was the right path. I returned to my work with the same drive and purpose. The teen project continued to develop, and although Adam was no longer a part of it, I understood that his influence would remain with me. He had taught me to value my ideas, to trust myself, even when at times I had felt lost. Each day became a small victory over myself, over the inner barriers I had created. I began to pay more attention to myself, to do things that brought me joy, no longer tied to the expectations of others. One day, after a few months, I ran into Adam by chance at a conference. It wasn't the kind of encounter that would reignite old feelings. We simply exchanged greetings, talked for a few minutes, but I felt that our story had truly come to an end. We had become different people, and that was right. I no longer felt the pull that had once existed between us. I just thanked him for the time we had spent together and moved on. When I returned home, Liam was sitting in our living room looking at old photographs we had taken back when things seemed simpler and clearer, before all the changes. We were silent, but I knew that this quiet moment was important for both of us. We might not get back what we had before, but we had begun to build a new path. And that path, though difficult, was ours. "You look happy," Liam said one evening when we were sitting together in the silence, and I finally answered honestly, "Yes, I feel a little more whole." We sat in silence, but there was no longer a divide between us. There were no expectations, no promises, but there was something that hadn't been lost: the desire to move forward, to be honest and open with each other. And that was enough.